Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Rage and welcome back to another one of my discussion videos. So this is kind of a sequel to two videos I made a little while ago, basically where I talked about the disappointment of modern horror games. Now in that video, I'm sure I already mentioned that the disappointment of modern horror games is mostly due to the fact that a lot of modern horror games are being made by very, very um, bad indie developers. Before I start the video, I would like to make a quick shout out to Miscelation. I will leave his channel in the description below. He is a very good YouTuber who also actually plays a lot of horror games on his channel, including Dead by Daylight. So definitely check out his channel after this video. And so yeah, survival horror is dead, and indie developers killed it. And the reason why I say survival horror is dead is because if you go on the Microsoft Store or the PlayStation Store or even on Steam, it's very hard to actually find a properly good survival horror game. The ones I've seen recently was Tormented Souls. Madison was a decent horror game. That was about it, honestly. The Callisto Protocol, I'm not too sure about the Callisto Protocol. I haven't played that one yet, but survival horror is just, it's not in a very good state like it used to be. And honestly, I blame Amnesia. I blame games like Amnesia and Outlast for the death of survival horror. Now, Amnesia and Outlast may have not killed survival horror, but its idea basically, the idea that it brought to the table, I feel is what killed survival horror because as you guys know, Amnesia introduced the whole you can't fight back nonsense. I have always hated this trend with horror games. You know, I cannot stand horror games that don't have combat. You know, they always annoy me, they always bore me. I don't really like just running away because I feel like that just leads to very tedious gameplay. I mean, games like Outlast, I could play that game for around 2 hours before I start getting bored out of my mind and I just gotta take a break or just stop playing altogether. I mean, I like games like Outlast and Amnesia because of their story and their atmosphere, not because of their gameplay. I feel like YouTubers like PewDiePie and Markiplier really hyped up those games more than they should have been because, in my honest opinion, I feel like horror games that don't have combat are probably some of the worst type of horror games you could play unless they're actually scary. And I'll admit, Amnesia and Outlast were definitely scary games, but that's why those games didn't need combat. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, but one of the reasons why modern horror games are so bad is because they lack everything. They lack everything that makes a horror game good. Because, as much as I hate to admit it, a good horror game doesn't need combat. Just because I don't like horror games without combat doesn't mean that horror games that don't have combat are bad. There are plenty of great horror games that don't have combat. I mean, one of them is actually my favorite. Like Visage, for example. I have praised that game a whole lot in the past. It's one of my favorite horror games of all time, and as you guys may or may not know, Visage does not give you an option for combat. But the reason why I love Visage so much is because the game is extremely scary. I think the developers of Visage actually spent more time making the game scary than focusing on actual gameplay, and that's actually really good because a horror game is obviously supposed to scare the player, and horror games in general are supposed to be more terrifying than horror movies because, unlike a horror movie, a horror game literally puts you in a scary and at times downright terrifying situation, and that is supposed to scare the absolute daylights out of someone way more than a movie does. So, horror games are obviously supposed to be scary. That's supposed to be the main thing about them. You play horror games to be scared. You play horror games to be terrified. So, Visage is a perfect example of a actual true horror game that does not need combat. Now, the problem with these indie developers, who are unfortunately the ones who are making most modern horror games, is not only are their games extremely repetitive, but they can't even make proper horror games because they don't even know how. I feel like a majority of indie horror developers, all they do is just look at actual popular horror games and they're like, oh, okay, so this was something that everyone really liked about this game. So I guess we'll just do the same thing, and hopefully they're like they'll like our game too. They'll give us $29.99. They'll like our game too, you know, because these indie horror game developers, they lack any creativity or originality. The first problem with these indie horror game devs is the fact that they all follow the same trend, which leads to their games having the same type of gameplay formula. I could describe most modern horror games with a few simple words: walking simulator, cryptic, easy to solve puzzles, no combat, and lackluster monsters. When you have games like Five Nights at Freddy's, Poppy Playtime, Hello Neighbor, or Bentley Indie Ink Machine, I think to myself, this is the horror games we have now. We have horror games where we run away from a average Joe with a shovel. These are the horror games we have now. These horror game developers do not know how to actually even make scary things in the first place. Oh, but they sure know how to make jump scares. They sure know how to make something just pop out at you, because yeah, that's gonna be scary enough. That'll definitely get a scare out of the player. Well, of course it's gonna get a scare out of them. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Jump scares are the lamest ways to actually get a genuine reaction out of the player, because obviously a jump scare is going to work. Obviously a jump scare is going to startle someone, but I've said this before as well. The actual jump scare doesn't actually even need to be scary. It's not even the actual jump scare that scares people, it's just a loud noise. A jump scare is literally just a loud noise. It's not even the actual thing that scares you, it's just a loud noise that startles you. So a jump scare is literally the lamest way to actually get a reaction out of the players. But that's the thing about these indie developers. These indie developers do not even try and be creative. They literally just copy and paste every other horror game that they see. And they do it in the most unoriginal way possible. They can't even be bothered to give their games a good setting. Most modern indie horror games are literally just set in some creepy house or large creepy building, or even like a motel room or building or something or whatever, or I don't know, just they just put you in a cliche creepy location and that's it. And the gameplay is even worse. The gameplay for most modern indie horror games is so repetitive. I mean, people say that first person shooters are all the same. Well, they clearly haven't seen how fucking tedious these modern horror games are, because most modern indie horror games are literally the exact same game. You could buy two indie horror games that only have a different title, and that is literally the only thing that's different about them, except for maybe a slightly different setting or different monsters that chase the player around. But other than that, the gameplay is all the same. And gameplay is obviously one of the most important parts about a game. When it comes to a horror game, it's also the scare factor. But let's take a look at some of the gameplay for these indie horror games. They are literally walking simulators. Like, these indie horror game developers don't even try and, spice up their gameplay a little bit. And this also is what proves that these indie horror game developers lack any creativity. It's like they're so desperate to just make a scary game for Steam just to make some YouTubers play it, because they know YouTubers are going to play it. Like, I'm a huge horror fan myself, but there are a lot of horror game YouTubers who will literally play every single horror game that comes out just for views. And these horror game developers know it. They know that mostly YouTubers and gullible people will buy their games, so they don't even care. They don't even need to actually add any creativity or originality in their games because they know that it's going to sell, even if they could give fuck all about the actual game that they're making. And these indie game horror developers, they're pretty damn scummy because they are essentially abusing the horror genre because they know that the horror genre is very profitable. But the least you could do is actually make your game worth it because these indie horror game developers are essentially selling us shit. They're selling us crap. And this is one of the reasons why they have pretty much killed the survival horror genre because the games that they are making are completely garbage. They lack some of the most important things that not only a horror game needs, but any game needs in general. It lacks any creativity, nor originality, or even passion from the actual developers. It's like these indie developers are just like, okay, we need to make a game and just make it scary. And they're just like, okay, how scary do you want it to be? And they're like, just make it scary. Okay, and they're like, how do you want the gameplay to be? Oh, just put the player in some spooky location, some spooky, scary location, and oh, put some puzzles here and there, and have some weird nemesis-like looking monster chase the player around. I actually played this one indie horror game called Don't Be Afraid, and the monster that chases you in this game looks like a dollar store version of Nemesis from Resident Evil 3. Like, seriously, these indie horror game developers lack so much originality and creativity. Like, it's bad enough that they can't even actually add anything new or fresh into the gameplay, but they can't even actually make proper horror work. Because their idea of horror is just some lame, annoying jump scares or some giant monster who looks like he came straight out of Sesame Street but on drugs. Like, I'm pretty sure I just described Poppy Playtime. Poppy Playtime is one of the worst games I've ever seen. Like, not only is that one of the worst horror game wannabe I've ever seen, it's one of the worst games I have ever seen in general. But back to the whole formula part. Every indie horror game is literally just the same. They are all just walking simulators. There's never any actual difference in the gameplay of these from these indie horror game developers. They look at games like Amnesia or Outlast or Observer or the Layers of Fear games and they're like, yeah, okay, this looks easy enough. And that's the thing. These indie developers just want to make a quick buck. That's the thing about these indie developers. They don't even care about making an actual good horror game. All they care about is just making a quick buck. That's why they copy games like Amnesia and Outlast. That's why all of these garbage ass indie horror games is literally just the same as every other garbage ass indie horror game. Because obviously, it takes a lot of thought and skill to actually make a horror game that has gameplay other than just walking around solving some garbage ass cryptic puzzles. Why do you think they copy games like Outlast and Amnesia? Because it's easy to make a game where all you do is just walk around and get chased by a scary monster while solving easy puzzles. Why do you think they never try and copy games like Resident Evil or Dead Space or The Evil Within? Because if they make a game that has action in it, then people won't think it's scary because it actually requires skill to make a horror game with combat that's still actually scary. That's why these garbage ass indie horror game developers always copy games like Amnesia and Outlast, and that's why I think Amnesia and Outlast killed this genre, because indie developers could easily copy Amnesia and Outlast's formula to make something even worse than those two games in general, because all they need to do is just make a game where you just walk around and solve puzzles and get chased by some stupid scary monster that's not even really scary at all. So the gameplay formula is obviously garbage because it's literally all the same. These indie game developers just do the same thing over and over and over and over again. Just make a horror game where all you do is just walk around because it's easy. It's easy to make a game where all you do is just walk around and solve some stupid ass puzzles. And then, of course, you have indie horror games where the developers don't even actually know how to make the game scary. I just said it before, but horror games don't always need combat to be good. Okay, games like Outlast and Visage and a recent horror game called Madison, these games are extremely scary, but they don't have any combat. But they're still pretty damn scary. These indie game developers don't even actually know how to make their games scary, and tension and fear is obviously an extremely crucial part of horror games because those are the things that scare the player. It's what makes the player feel like they're in a dire situation filled with danger around every corner of where they are. And these indie developers, they can't even actually make scary things in their horror games. And I'm thinking to myself, how could these assholes even make a horror game and yet they don't even actually know how to make proper horror? But that just goes back to my point about how they literally lack so much creativity. Because if they had any creativity, they would at least try and make the gameplay good, and they would try and actually make the horror game that they're making actually have horror in it. Because these garbage ass indie developers do not even know how to make proper horror in their games, but of course, jump scares. So, you guys get what I'm saying? They copy games like Amnesia and Layers of Fear because those games are easy gameplay. It's easy to make a game where all you do is walk around, and the reason why their games only have jump scares is because they don't know how to actually make true horror. So they just use jump scares. These garbage ass indie horror games are so cheap. And these shitty indie devs are literally just trying to make a quick buck off of gullible people and YouTubers who are inevitably going to play these games for views. And it's a shame that they even get views in the first place. Like, not only are these indie developers bad, but a lot of you YouTubers out there are also pretty trash. I mean, YouTubers like Markiplier and PewDiePie, who are obviously already overrated YouTubers, they will play these garbage, shitty indie horror games just for views. And since they have so many subscribers, they know they're gonna get views. Like, if I had a lot of subscribers, I would not be doing that shit. I would not be playing these garbage ass indie horror games. But yeah, so it's a shame that this is where most modern horror games are coming from. This is why survival horror is dying, because these shitty indie horror game developers are ruining it because their games are essentially shit. I mean, and the fact that they all follow the same formula too. Like indie horror game developers, not only do they just copy all of the popular horror games, but they even copy each other because when other indie horror game developers see that other shitty indie horror games are actually making money, they will quickly follow the same trend and do the same thing. And this is why so many indie horror games have such similar shitty gameplay, just walking around solving cryptic ass puzzles while being chased by something that's not even that scary. And not only that, but even the chase scenes in these games are garbage. Looking back at another game I played, there was this other indie horror game I played. I felt like I was playing as a stickman while I was running from the monster that I was being chased by. Like, not only is the gameplay for these shitty indie horror games, not only is it literally the same as all of the other shitty indie horror games, but even the mechanics suck. Like, even the fucking mechanics suck. And of course, it's all just solving puzzles. There's no combat, there's no creativity, there's no originality. These garbage ass indie horror game developers are ruining the horror genre because all of their games are literally just copy and paste. It's literally just the same thing over and over and over and over again. Just put the player in a scary setting and have the player just walk around, explore, and just solve puzzles and just be chased by things that aren't even scary, which takes away all the tension and all the fear, and then it's not even a horror game anymore. It's just a boring ass walking simulator. Like, what am I supposed to make of this garbage? And of course, these garbage horror games have polluted the market as well. You go on any digital marketplace, and this is all the horror games you see. Every survival horror game from the past are the only ones that are left. There is no actual good modern survival horror games out here anymore. And if there are, then they are extremely rare. Now, I'm not going to say that every indie horror game is bad. There's definitely a couple of good ones out there. Vsauce is already one of them, but I'm just saying most of them are just not good. Because you have these garbage ass indie horror game developers who just want to make a quick buck. They don't even care about making a good game. Why do you think their games are so cliche? Why do you think their horror games are literally just the same as every other horror game you ever played? Because they see that people will play a horror game even if it is the exact same as the last one they played, because horror fans are gullible idiots. I'm glad that there are actually some YouTubers on here who don't want these games anymore. I'm glad that there are people like me, actual unhappy horror fans like me, who don't want these garbage ass indie horror games polluting the market anymore. Because these are not good horror games. They're not good games in general. They're just copy and paste dog shit from greedy, scummy ass indie developers who are like, oh wow, so people like this type of horror game. Okay, Donnie, let's make this game where the player just walks around and solves puzzles. And then another indie developer is like, hey Timmy, these developers done this. Let's do the same thing as they done because they actually made money. Like, this shit pisses me off. Like, this shit honestly pisses me off. Because when I want to play a good horror game, I see that this is the only shit we have on the market and it pisses me off. It really does. I think Bentley and the Ink Machine is the only actual decent indie horror game out there. It's somewhat decent, but it's still pretty shitty. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this discussion video. Let me know what you think about this whole indie horror game dev bullshit thing. I mean, it really pisses me off because the horror game market is polluted with these garbage ass games, and it really pisses me off. We need to put an end to these indie horror game developers. Don't spend your money on these games. Even if they're on sale, don't spend your money. Show these scummy ass indie developers that we don't want their cliche dog shit. Show them that we want better. But they can't do it anyways because they don't have any creativity and they don't have any skill. So just wait for a developer like the one for the Callisto Protocol to actually make good horror games. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching this discussion video. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you stuck by all the way till the end, thank you so very much. I appreciate viewers like you from the bottom of my heart. But anyways, thank you guys so very much for watching this video. Let me know what you think about this. And yeah, I will see you guys in the next video. Be sure to like, share, comment, subscribe. And yeah, this is Mr. Rage, and I will see you guys soon. Take care, y'all.